To an extent, the answer is yes. But of course, at the end of the day, you need an airplane or you need a quadcopter with a team that would actually deliver the bomb and destroy the facility or kill this individual.
Ronen, could you give us a sense of what was actually hit? I mean, there was a senior level personnel, so leaders of the regime were hit. Mm-hmm. In terms of infrastructure, military infrastructure, nuclear infrastructure, I mean, and where there's a lot of reporting about an operation against the nuclear infrastructure in Natanz, but there's nothing. I'm not hearing much about Fordo. So I just think we're trying to understand what so far has been hit that we know of.
Yeah, so I think we're talking about 10 to 15 individuals that were targeted, most of them in Tehran, at least 6 cities, among them Tabriz, Isfahan, Kashan, Arak, Ahwaz, and Tehran. And facilities, part of them for storage of missiles, air defenses, and nuclear sites. Natanz and Perchin, there's still unclarity about the famous, used to be secret facility inside the mountain near Fordo, which is considered to be the most fortified and hard to access enrichment site. And I have some more reporting about 2 factories that are producing centrifuges and one other factory that is producing what they call the planetary mixers that are massive mixers for the production of solid fuel and explosive. You cannot make ballistic missile without mixers. It crippled the ability of Iran to produce ballistic missiles.
Any sense for Israeli resources that were deployed? For instance, back in the October 24, I was given some estimate that something along the lines of like a third of the Israeli Air Force was deployed for that operation. Any sense for the scale of what was involved here?
Yeah, I believe that this is much higher, much bigger. We're talking about much of the Israeli Air Force taking off. One of the reasons, by the way, is to make sure that the airfields are empty, fearing Iranian retaliation. But we're talking about numerous squadrons of fighting jets, together with quadcopters, together with long-range drones. Well, much of that fleet needs either aerial or ground fueling in other areas of the Middle East, on the way to Tehran, to Iran, on the way back. So you need fueling tankers. You need intelligence vehicles or intelligence jets and command and control jets. And I would assume that we are talking about many thousands of soldiers and intelligence operatives back in Israel, monitoring, helping, communicating, commanding the operation from afar, while keeping a close tab on what is happening in Iran every minute. So that specific IRGC leader is in the room where Israel is planning to target, and to have everything synchronized, to have so many people being monitored, because Israel is aiming to kill them. It takes a lot of manpower. And for days, much of the IDF has been dealing with nothing but gearing up towards the attack, while many of the soldiers and the officers not sure until the last moment the decision will indeed be taken and the strike will be launched.
Was there anything that from your understanding, that Israel was trying to take out, at least in the waves tonight, that they weren't able to achieve?
First of all, there's one target that is or could be potentially, I don't know if more important, but very important on the target list that, as far as I know, was not chosen.
Not chosen?
Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Okay.
As far as I understand, he was not targeted. It's a matter of decision to go for I would say, decapitation of much of the Iranian leadership, but leave the leader in his place, and maybe as a signal or as a symbolic message to say to him, listen, we could take you out as well. We left you alive. You should not continue to any kind of retaliation because you could be next.
Yeah, right.
Are we aware of any IDF casualties so far?
No, I don't think that there were.
Based on your reporting, how did Iran respond? Before we get into what we think Iran's response will be, just how did they respond over the last few hours? What were they doing?
The anti-aircraft defenses of Iran were on high alert for a long time. They have tried to fire. They were ready to an extent, but the S-300 has a range of something like 700 kilometers. Israel developed secret weapon that can take them out from 1,500 kilometers. So, nothing that they could, that the Iranians could match. Now, without having the S-300, enabling them to take out the remaining few dozens of batteries of tactical air defenses.
And while Israel's conducting the operation, given that, as you said, that Israel started by taking out key personnel in the command structure, in the command hierarchy of the Iranian military, of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, of other parts of the Iranian security apparatus, did that completely disrupt? Because this is comparable to when Israel took out Nasrallah and the Hezbollah leadership is first take out the decision makers so that they didn't know what to do because Israel had taken out the leadership. Was that the same idea here?
The same idea was to really destabilize the whole command and control system and leave the organization, in the Hezbollah case, or the country, or the regime in the Iran case, in total disarray. But there's something more that I think makes a perfect comparison between the two cases. In a way, similar to what happened to Israel on October 7, where Israel believed that they know the enemy better than the enemy knows itself. Look at what happened in the world in the 24 hours prior to the Israeli strike. I think that there were very few people in the Middle East and Europe and the US who didn't know or didn't suspect or didn't thought that Israel is going to strike. But the Iranians, they kept on publishing statements saying, we know what the Israelis and Trump are doing. They are just flexing muscles in order to put more pressure
on the
towards the negotiation on Sunday.
Yeah.
And so Israel took them by surprise and took advantage of the fact that they don't see a need to go to an emergency status.
And what are the expectations for Iran's response now?
I think that is a unanimous assessment. We should be expecting hard days for Israeli citizens everywhere in Israel. Iran has a remaining fleet of ballistic missiles. So the bottom line, Iran is expected to retaliate. The question is how, for how long, and will it lead Iran to explode the negotiation, leave the negotiation, not coming to discuss a possible solution with the US on Sunday, because identifying the US and Israel in cahoot behind this attack, or understanding that not negotiating could lead to even more catastrophic results, which could potentially threaten the sole existence of the regime.
I think many of us believed it was probably just a matter of time before Israel would target Iran's nuclear program. But what's clear from tonight is that Israel has been much more ambitious than strictly targeting Iran's nuclear program. It has targeted parts of, not the entirety of, but so far from what we understand, parts of the Iranian regime. Now, maybe that is in service of taking out the nuclear program, but there's also the possibility of the regime just crumbling. I mean, I think what we learned from December of 2024, from the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, a regime that had been in power for 53 years, and then it meets a little bit of resistance, and in a matter of 13 days, the regime crumbles in a way that it couldn't crumble after like 13 plus years of civil war. And then in 13 days, there's this revolt, there's this uprising, and the regime,
It's
this regime
not
that's been
gonna
around for over
happen.
half a century, falls. And we're all sitting there saying, wait a minute, this regime was far more wobbly than we expected. So if the Iranian people who are frustrated with this regime ever thought there was a moment where this regime looks weak, I would think it would be now.
No.
I believe this is the weakest moment in Iranian modern history. So since the revolution and the establishment of the Islamic Republic, it's weaker and seen weaker more than in the toughest days of the Iran-Iraq war. And they were tough days. There were people in Israeli intelligence that for a long time were thinking how to destabilize the regime and take it down. I assume that these people are looking at the moment, if not directly involved in the planning, and thinking what else Israel can do to accelerate pressure. I would assume that Israel is also aiming to suggest or convince the US to take a part here, not just standing aside and helping Israel in case it needs defense, but having a crucial part in finishing this task. I think this could be another goal for Israel now, is to convince the US to take a much more decisive role, use the robust American military capabilities that Israel doesn't have. So, for example, the B-2 bombers potentially launched from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. So these can carry few of the mother of all bombs. That is like almost 11 tons of explosive, of bunker busters. That can be dropped and destroy even the most fortified, the most deep Iranian sites. This is something Israel cannot do. They don't have the bombs and they don't have the bombers to carry it. I could see Israel now, after something that is at least for now looking as a great success militarily, intelligence-wise, operationally, I could see Israel potentially lobbying with the US, trying to convince the US to enter.
Ronen, what should we expect in the days ahead in terms of, will Israel continue with further waves of attacks for, I've heard estimates of like another week of this?
Yeah, a week is more or less what was planned before the attack started. 4 days to a week. But there are two sides here. It depends also on Iran. While we speak, there's the news coming about 100 drones that were fired, that were launched from Iran, so suicide drones. So they're on their way. It takes hours for a drone, a slow vehicle, to get to Israel, but they're on their way. And I assume this is just the beginning. And Israel also has more targets to hit in Iran. I think we are looking at a week that is going to be a tough, very tough week for the people of Israel.
Last question. Roughly speaking, how many years in the making was an operation like we witnessed tonight?
It started in 2008.
Nice.
First, they wanted to take out Natanz. Then they discovered Fordow. So they started to discover Fordow. Then they did a massive cyber operation, Stuxnet, Olympic Games, that delayed the process there. So we're talking about 2 decades of collection of intelligence, translation of that intelligence into an actual plans, and all of that reaching a peak in the last, let's say, 3 years, when the intelligence penetration into Iranian ranks was, I would say, not less extensive than the one against Hezbollah. And we saw what were the achievements, what were successes against Hezbollah. The ability to monitor Iranian officials in real time. Israeli intelligence in the previous 2 attacks in April and October of last year, when the Iranians attacked Israel, Israeli intelligence knew what will be launched and precisely what hour. And then, during the last year, the Air Force started to make more and more drills. And one of the things that alerted the Iranians, but yet not alerted them enough because they still didn't believe, were massive drills of hundreds of Israeli airplanes taking off, flying into the sea, doing all sorts of drills during aerial fueling, etc., and coming back. Now, this is not a demonstration. This is not in order to go and visit someone's yacht. It's clear, there's only one thing they can rehearse, which is striking Iran. But in spite of all that, and Iran sees this like nobody, you cannot miss it. Iran saw it. There was alertness in Iran. There were even some suggestions in Israeli intelligence that Iran might strike first, which led to the total evacuation of many military sites in Israel in the last 24 hours. But yet, luckily for Israel, the Iranians didn't get it. They thought there's no way that Israel would launch the attack.
All right, Ronen, I'm sure we'll be speaking to you again in the next, the weeks ahead. Thank you for doing this at this, at least odd hour for me. Keep in touch.
Will do. Thank you, Dan.
That's our show for today. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with others who might appreciate it. Time and again, we found that our
Hi everybody. Please excuse the t-shirt and the bags under my eyes. We were woken up at night. I'm the only member of my family who, despite multiple attempts, failed to get back to sleep. The kids are home from school. We don't know for how long, possibly 3 days, possibly 2 weeks. Israel struck Iran. Israel struck Iran massively, went after the nuclear program. We know that the strikes were in 10 locations, Natanz being the major uranium enrichment center. Some significant portion of it is destroyed. We don't quite know how much. From Tabriz all the way in the north to Shiraz down in the south. A huge campaign, 200 planes, cruise missiles fired from Iraqi airspace. Everything we have seen in the exchanges between Iran and Israel up until now, during which Israel systematically degraded Iranian air defenses back in October, back in April of last year. All these capabilities that Israel showed, that it began mapping out, came to fruition. And the operation was astonishing. People have asked me many times, can Israel do it alone? And my answer has always been, it would be long, it would be hard. Iran has competence, it has thousands of missiles it can launch at Israel. It has proxies, we don't know how capable those proxies are around Israel. But mostly it's far away, and it would require maybe potentially even boots on the ground. Folks, we discovered today that there were boots on the ground. An unbelievable Mossad drone factory within Iranian soil, producing and launching the drones from Iranian soil. Everything we saw the Ukrainians do in Russia 2 weeks ago, the Mossad has just upped the ante, and it's been working years to build that capability. Israel turned out to have tremendous competence, long planning, and absolute willingness to actually take the fight to the enemy. And it is definitely not yet over. So everything I'm going to tell you today is preliminary. Everything I'm going to tell you today is something to think about, is something that, frankly, some of it may not be true in a week. Nevertheless, I want to share with you 4 thoughts. It isn't over. Fordo, one of the really major facilities that are also hardest for Israeli ordnance to penetrate, has not yet been hit. We don't know if it will be. We don't know what kind of capabilities Israel has. We do know that if the nuclear program is going to be set back significantly strategically for 10 years rather than for 6 months, it's hard not to hit a few more of the more protected sites. So all of that comes to say that there's a lot that we still don't know, and not all of this is going to turn out to have been completely accurate. The enemy gets to a big say in what happens in war. The enemy has also been preparing, presumably, although the incompetence of this enemy so far has surprised us. That might be a good thing, and it might just be a timing thing. They might be caught on their back feet and they might recover, and we might actually face a much more significant Iranian response. I want to share with you 4 thoughts, and these are thoughts that I think some of them may turn out to have been slightly incorrect, but I think that they will basically turn out to be true and will carry us through however long this goes and however it ends up. My first thought is the astonishing brazenness, the unbelievable competence of the Mossad, of the Air Force, of various other units that have been involved in doing this, of the Israeli security forces, and the fundamental strategy. All of these things are a function, ironically, paradoxically, of Israeli humility, of a special kind of new Israeli consciousness that I want to talk about, because it matters to understanding Israel. 20 months ago, I argued that a new Israel was born on October 7 that will not stop before the fight comes to Iran. So far, just about everything I have said has turned out to be absolutely correct in terms of how this Israeli consciousness has played out on the regional stage. The second point I want to mention is I was nevertheless wrong about one very critical factor, which was Benjamin Netanyahu. I have been arguing for almost 20 months.
That's gonna be his
not so much
legacy.
at the beginning, but certainly by the spring of last year, that he is a politician who always chooses the path of least resistance and one probably, potentially, I fear, not actually capable of seeing through the kind of war to demolish these Islamist ideologies and ideologues and regimes around us that seek our destruction. Israel was a country unified, capable, willing, and strong, and we were led by someone who was not. I was wrong. He understood the strength of his people, the resilience of this people. He understood our willingness to take this fight to the enemy. He understood that Israelis understand that the Iranian nuclear program has to be removed, because on October 7 we learned that our enemies are not deterrable when they have these ideologies of redemption. They're willing to destroy their own polities in order to destroy us. He, in this moment, showed that he was what we needed him to be.
Yeah.
And that's something I have to say, and I owe him, and I owe Israel, and I owe just myself to say out loud and clearly, because it is something I personally, and we know many Israelis as well, have doubted up until now. I have never been happier to be wrong. This mattered. This is the moment that mattered.
Yeah.
And he was up to it.
Yeah.
Point 3, Iran's incompetence, and I'm going to get back to this, has a reason. It has a deep source. And it's the same source for Russia's incompetence in the war with Ukraine. And it's generally the same source for just about all of our enemies. It's why we keep winning. I don't know if God sits up in heaven and decides who to give victory to in each battle. I certainly, for every prophet that says God is backing the Jews in war, there's a prophet that says he's not. For example, look up the prophet Amos, chapter 9. I certainly think that there are structural, systemic reasons. You don't have to go to cosmic ones to understand why our enemies keep stumbling over themselves and keep giving us the victory. And I want to talk about them because they matter for the future, and they matter, frankly, for how our enemies understand this loss so far. And 4, to my brothers and sisters in the diaspora, I want to tell you about hobbits, about how to respond in this delicate moment to the hobbits. Before I get into the nitty-gritty and really try and walk through this, I want to tell you that this episode is sponsored by Brenda Yablon. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Brenda, who is sponsoring this episode in honor of the brave men and women of the IDF, without whose courage and selflessness Israel would not exist. For those pilots, those men and women, those Mossad agents and commandos who are far from home right now and doing the thing that our kids need them to be doing for our kids to be safe. I think about them a lot. So Let's get into it. The Israeli strike was unexpected. It was unexpected by Israelis. I was asked yesterday, I gave a briefing, and I was asked, is this actually going to end in a strike? And I said, there's too much telegraphing. Everyone was saying that we were going to strike. That's not how you do a strike. So my guess is this was leverage. This was an attempt to pressure Iran ahead of the sixth round of talks that was going to take place in Oman today, Friday, the 13th of June. It turned out to be the opposite. It turned out that the tension between Trump and Netanyahu was the show. And in fact, everything was in place for the Israeli strike, and the Americans were in on it. That makes sense. Even if the Americans don't want Israel to do it, and even if the Americans don't join Israel in doing it, Israel can't do it without the Americans knowing. Israel might be able to sneak up on Iran with its air force, without Iran being aware of it over Iraqi airspace. But Israel can't traverse Iraqi airspace without CENTCOM knowing it. So that coordination needed to be there, and it turns out that it was. But nevertheless, it surprised us all. There had been talk of such a strike on and off for well over a decade, and so why think this was different? But the truth is, this was different. And I want to explain why this was different and why it happened now. And this is something I've been arguing for 20 months, but I want to reiterate that argument. I've made it elsewhere, other podcasts, articles. I want to clarify this argument because I think it explains a lot of the Israeli mind. If you like Israel, great, you should know this. If you don't like Israel, you need to know this about what Israelis think is happening. There is a new Israeli consciousness, and it has already been responsible for the dismantling of Hezbollah as a strategic actor, for the downfall of the Assad regime, for the humbling repeatedly of the Ayatollahs. And it's a consciousness that is actually born not in bravado, not in self-confidence, but the opposite, in a deep humility. And it's a humility that flows from October 7. What happened to Israelis on October 7? We thought we understood the enemy. We thought we understood that the enemy was deterred, that the enemy was contained, that the enemy was afraid of our firepower. The Hamas in Gaza had built 500 kilometers of tunnels in a 25-kilometer territory, precisely because it was not deterred by our firepower. It counted on our firepower.
Yeah.
We thought they were deterred by the fact that we have tremendous destructive capability, and Hamas's strategic response, and it's a brilliant one. And those tunnels are the biggest thing Palestinians have ever built. Hamas bent Gaza's entire economy for a decade and a half to build them. They are 500 kilometers of tunnels in a 25-kilometer territory, absolutely unprecedented by almost an order of magnitude in the history of warfare. And the point of those tunnels was to reverse the deterrence. Instead of them being deterred by our firepower, we were deterred by our own firepower. Because the cost to entering Gaza to chase after Hamas, because of those tunnels, was made absolutely immense in civilian casualties, in destruction. Thousands of tunnel entrances, if you want to take out that tunnel system, would have to be destroyed, every single one of them in a building. Mostly residential, but also mosques, hospitals, schools, etc. And so the cost for Palestinians in Gaza, obviously, but the knock-on costs for Israel were so great that in fact we could not imagine any threat Hamas could ever pose to us that would make it worth it for us to go after them into Gaza. And after building that unbelievably immense tunnel network, unprecedented, and air-conditioned and electrified, after building that network, Hamas carried out October 7th. In other words, we thought they were deterred by our firepower. We did not realize that they had, through that tunnel system, managed to create a battlefield in Gaza that had deterred us because of our own firepower. What were we going to do with that firepower? Demolish Gaza in the hunt for Hamas? And then they carried out October 7. And then we discovered not only that we hadn't understood that deterrence was a much more complex thing, and they understood it better than we did. We actually, on October 7, understood that our fundamental theory of them, which is that they were deterrable by the damage that we could cause to Gaza, was the opposite. The damage to Gaza was their strategy. They carried out on October 7, engineered to draw the Israelis into an invasion after building that tunnel network under Gaza. In other words, they carried out two atrocities on October 7, not one. One was against us. They murdered civilians. They murdered children. The second one was against Gaza. It was the planned drawing of an Israeli war, absolute, devoted, committed war to get Hamas. The drawing of that war into Gaza. And here's the thing. If you don't like Israel and that sounds to you like some kind of blaming of Gaza for Gaza's destruction rather than Israel for Gaza's destruction, it's the opposite. If you think the Israelis are evil, heartless monsters who would gladly destroy Gaza, then Hamas's strategy is doubly monstrous. It counted on us being that. I happen to think we're good people stuck in a bad situation facing an evil enemy, willing to destroy their own polity and premising their strategy on the destruction of their own polity. But if you disagree with me and think we're evil, that makes Hamas worse. That makes Hamas's foundational strategy worse.
Yes.
And we came away from October 7 with many, many thoughts, many, many lessons. The great trauma of October 7 for Israelis was not the discovery that Hamas would murder our kids. That we knew that. We all came through the Second Intifada.
Yes.
The great discovery was that the trauma was that we failed our people. We did not show up. We broke our bond of solidarity, our promise to each other that is our foundational ethos as a people, this refugee nation, that when they started standing shoulder to shoulder and fighting for each other, stopped dying in the 20th century. We broke that promise to those people. I remember October 7 like it was yesterday, and the trauma for me was sitting on my phone watching the WhatsApp groups of people I know screaming into the WhatsApp group, "Where is everybody? I can hear them outside our door." But the deep lesson, outside of that trauma, the deep lesson was that we were mistaken. We had totally misunderstood the enemy. We had misunderstood how they understand deterrence. We had misunderstood their willingness to destroy their own polities because they have this vast religious redemption vision that they were living in, this story that didn't make any sense to us. So we assumed it wasn't for real, it was just rhetoric. We misunderstood that it wasn't they who were deterred, it was us. And we misunderstood their willingness to seek out that destruction. And the Israel that came out of October 7, and I have to emphasize this because this is the key point, was a deeply humble Israel. You cannot deter an enemy for whom the destruction of their own polity is their strategy. That's an undeterrable enemy. That's, by the way, why they do it. That's the great advantage, the military advantage. It makes them vastly more dangerous, even if they have, tech that's much less advanced. And then we looked north to Hezbollah, to 200,000 rockets and missiles buried under the 300 villages of South Lebanon. And we said, wait a second. We have no idea what Hamas is. And we've lived next to Hamas for 4 decades. We have to assume that we have no idea what Hezbollah is. That we're missing the point. That we're actually not good at psychoanalyzing the enemy and determining whether they're deterred or not. And that meant that every one of those 200,000 rockets and missiles, we have to assume were going to be used. They were not there not to be used. And so Hezbollah had to be removed. Not negotiated, not deterred, not contained, removed. Israel switched from a psychology of threat containment, threat deterrence, to a psychology of threat removal. And that's true on all fronts. The Israeli commandos that have been raiding southern Syria to get at arms caches for the last 4 months, we're doing that. No more allowing any infrastructure to build on any of our borders until they're a giant monster that requires a terrible war. Nothing that seeks to destroy us gets to live alongside us.
Yes.
Because we're not very good at understanding them, at psychologizing them, at analyzing and understanding and thinking through deterrence the way they think through deterrence. Intellectual humility has made us more dangerous than them. And the same is true of Iran. The Iranian regime genuinely believes that it is a Shia revolutionary front for the redemption of Islam, first of all for the salvation of the Shia, the validation of the Shia in the face of the Sunni, and then ultimately the conquest of the world and the redemption of the world. It believes it, it says it, it talks it, it requires this faith from its top leadership and commanders. We no longer believe that we have the intellectual chops. By the way, we think that all the Western intellectuals, the realists and the these and the that, who think they know exactly what Iran is and deterrable or undeterrable, believe it or don't believe it, we think they're also faking it. We no longer think we have the ability to determine Iranians and the Iranian leadership are people. They're big, they're complex, they're sophisticated, they're three-dimensional, they're deep. And you will not understand them. So you have to believe them. Humility brings us simplicity. And that simplicity is what we saw on display last night. And the Middle East is only beginning to be reshaped.
Yeah.
Because the Iran that will emerge from this war, and this war may go bad for Israel, there are thousands of ballistic missiles that could land on Tel Aviv and set it on fire, and I say it right now out loud. But the Iran that will emerge from it is an Iran that everybody knows cannot withstand Israel. Can't stand up to it, and will only destroy itself in the attempt to destroy Israel. It will not have nukes, and there is nothing Israel won't do to make sure of it. And if it stops these genocidal, religious, redemptionist, revolutionary wars everywhere that have killed hundreds of thousands in the Middle East already, then it will suddenly turn around and notice this idiotic regime that Iran is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, inhabited by one of the poorest nations in the world. And for no good reason except deep mismanagement and oppression by this dictatorship. Thursday night marked the dawning of a new strategic architecture in the Middle East. A new simplicity, a new bluntness, a new willingness to fight. It has been building up for 20 months. It was there right after October 7, and it will be there for years to come. And it has changed everything. And now I want to dive a little bit deeper into Iran's incompetence. Because I think Iran's incompetence, their constant obsession with Israel's death, their willingness to sacrifice a double-digit percentage of their GDP over a generation on the destruction of a country they have no interest in and no borders with, and their deep, profound incompetence as a regime, I want to suggest that those are, in fact, deeply linked. Wanting to destroy us, that's a general rule of our enemies, is a good indicator that you are the sort of entity or organization, state, that can't actually destroy us. The very desire is a signal of the weakness that will prevent you from being able to do so. Tonight showed how incompetent and inept Iran has become under this authoritarian theocracy. I did not expect the attack, that's true. But Iran should have. Iran should have. It should have noticed that its air defenses were gone. It should have noticed that Netanyahu was chomping at the bit. It should have noticed that Trump was saying, I don't know if they'll attack. It should at least have secured its top leadership. The entire leadership of the IRGC Air Force was taken out in a single hit. And that was made possible by the fact that they refused to notice that they were actually utterly defenseless, and rendered that way by Israel very easily back in October. Their nuclear sites are exposed to us, the ones that are not deeply buried under a mountain like Fordo. And their military bases are being shattered. And the Mossad operation from within Iranian territory took out a huge amount of their ability to respond with ballistic missiles. And all of that was something they could have looked at the Ukrainian attack in Russia and said to themselves, wait a second, if Ukraine can do that to Russia, what are the chances Israel can't do it to us? But they didn't, because they're incompetent. Ukraine should not be doing as well as it's doing against Russia. It's a quarter the size in population. Israel is a tenth the population of Iran. And it has not only held Iran at bay, in fact shattered the Iranian proxy system. It has done so, I submit, fairly easily. It has not yet used the full might of all of its firepower because it's backed against a wall, lashing out desperately. And I think that the reason is democracy. Now, there have been democracies crushed by dictatorships. In World War II, the Nazis went after the French. I want to make a specific point, not just generalized point, that no democracy can ever fall in a war against a dictatorship. But in the present day, if you have a regime that's anti-West, if you have a regime that's obsessed with its own ideology of its own self-importance, that doesn't have the feedback mechanisms. One of the things the Russian army discovered after invading Ukraine was that a great many of the tanks that it thought it had on paper didn't have fuel and didn't have spare parts. And so they were there on paper, but in fact so much of the money of the military had disappeared into corruption. Well, the feedback loops that democracies automatically build into these kinds of institutions prevent that. When the Ukrainians said we have a tank, they actually had a tank with all of the supply chain required to have that tank. And so it turned out that this vast Russian military on paper was a much smaller and less competent military in the actual field. That's a democracy difference. It also turns out that there are more fundamental differences between democracies and dictatorships. Solidarity.
Yeah.
I have 4 kids. I'm going to send my kids to the Israeli military when they are old enough. The oldest is 14. I have about 3.5 years before my oldest son is a soldier. I'm not sending them to the state to become a soldier to defend the state because I have some desperate loyalty to the state to the point where I'm willing to sacrifice my kids. The state exists to protect my kids. My kids don't exist to protect the state. So why am I sending them to the army? An army that, by the way, unlike, the Australian army or forgive me, Australians, I like you, but, your army doesn't fight a whole lot of wars. Unlike the Belgian army, doesn't actually will have to potentially go into harm's way. And the simple answer is because right now, a lot of other Israelis have their kids in the army, protecting my kids. And when I was a young man, I was in the army protecting other people's young kids. There is a circle of solidarity in which the 18 to 21-year-olds protect all of us. And when it is our turn to join those ranks, we are repaying a debt. I owe the rest of my compatriots the safety of my children. And my children will serve in the knowledge that all others around them will serve to protect them as well. You can only have that in a democracy. It's much harder for an elected leader to send children to war over an extended period of time for a fantasy of his own grandeur, or of a great religious redemption, as in the case of Iran. And a democracy also tends to have a free economy that produces innovation. Innovation of the type that could put, Israel in the lead in this new kind of war. No country on earth is prepared for the new kind of war that everyone suddenly woke up and noticed might be the future of war in the Ukrainian drone attack on the Russian military. No country in the world is more prepared for that than Israel. No country in the world has a more layered missile defense, more technological advances in that regard specifically, between Iron Dome and David Sling and all the other missile defense and Iron Beam, which is coming online. No country on earth is more prepared for this war. And if we were not a democracy with a free and open economy, we would not be prepared, because we would not have that innovation, and we would not have that economic backbone that could provide for that innovation. And finally, serving elites. In the Battle of Cannae, between Rome and Hannibal, something like a quarter of the Roman Senate was killed in the battle. You can hate the Senate, you can like the Senate, you can hate the Roman Empire, you can like the Roman Empire, but at least when it was a republic, it very much had an elite that believed it was a serving elite. It was an elite in the service of the state and the people of Rome. Republics have that. Israel has that. And you only get that in a democracy. Finally, I want to talk to you about hobbits. In The Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien writes in the introduction to the 3-volume series, the Shire had no need of watchtowers or walls, and its peace had been maintained more by the vigilance of its friends than by any efforts of its own. Yet the hobbits continued to live as they had lived for centuries, in a state of blissful ignorance, unaware that they were being watched and protected.
It's fucking risk.
The hobbits, Tolkien explains, had been protected for so long that they had forgotten that they were protected. There is evil in this world. I'm sorry that it's there, but it's there. Westerners have forgotten, many of them, that there's evil out there in the world, not because the world has become without evil, the world has somehow fundamentally changed, but because they themselves have no experience of this evil. And the reason they have no experience of this evil across generations is that they've lived under someone's protection for so long that they have forgotten that there is an active protector protecting them from these evils. That protector, the mightiest human power the world has ever seen, is the United States of America, which has led and really constructed the post-war world. It has secured it. That's why America has such vast military power and forces, and a navy that's bigger than several of the next biggest navies combined. America built the post-war world and created in that world the happiest, safest, and most prosperous time in all of human history. But that doesn't mean evil is gone. And America is not always there. Evil comes from the same place it always came from. Human beings bent by visions of revenge or redemption, thinking they're righteous and pursuing bad things. The Iranian regime is such an evil, and it wants a nuke to advance these visions. And it might use that nuke, because I'm an Israeli who no longer trusts my own psychoanalysis of the enemy to determine whether they're deterred. See above. And so they can't have a nuke at any cost, because I now assume they're going to use it. Israel cannot rely on others. It trusts America, it coordinates with America, it believes in America. When Obama came to power, he had incredibly high favorability ratings in Israel. And when Trump came to power, he had very high favorability ratings in Israel. Israelis don't entirely distinguish the American culture wars. They don't 100% understand them. What it is that Israelis love about America has nothing to do with Republican or Democrat. It is the awareness. They have not fallen into the trap of the hobbits, of being protected for so long that they forgot that they were being protected. Germany, with its 1.6% GDP spent on defense, might count as such a hobbit until Putin suddenly invaded Ukraine. Israel's GDP is about 5% expended just on defense. Israel is not confused on that point. Israel loves America deeply, instinctively, intuitively. It understands the gift that America has given humanity over the last 80 years, a gift America might no longer want to give humanity because it has spent and bled for everybody else. And I respect the American desire to pull back a little bit on those expenses. And so the lesson for Israel is that over-relying on others, over-relying even on friends as mighty and as decent as America, isn't safe, and it isn't honorable. The one thing we can give America is to at least fight for ourselves before we come asking for support and help. We don't have the luxury as Jews of forgetting that the world isn't safe. And we have enemies that keep reminding us of that. And so we Israelis, whether you love us or hate us, whether you didn't care about us and then in the Gaza war decided you don't like us, nevertheless, we Israelis must take this step. We have to take out the Iranian regime's evil. It is a blight on the world and on the region. It has launched hundreds of missiles at our cities. It has talked for decades about our destruction. It has propped up Assad and enabled Assad to murder 600,000 Syrians and expel and drive out of Syria millions more. It is half of the Yemeni civil war, which had 250,000 people starved to death in that country just 6-7 years ago. The Iranian regime has been responsible for a destruction and internal self-immolation of state after state after state in the Middle East and in the Arab world. And the Iranian regime cannot be allowed to have a nuke. And when we go after that regime and its nuclear program, as the millions of anxious hobbits, people who are safe but don't understand what makes them safe and don't understand that the world is not necessarily safe just because their experience of it is a safe one. They will tweet angrily that everything's good and all war is unnecessary, and if a single child dies in a single strike in Iran to take out that regime, then Israel is a vast empire of evil that has to be destroyed. We Israelis don't stand before anyone else to be judged. The only people we care about who will judge us, the only judgment that matters to us, is the judgment of our children a generation from now. An Iranian nuke that triggers a Saudi nuke, that triggers a Turkish nuke, that dismantles the NPT, and in order to fend off China after the discovery that America won't stop the nuclear proliferation of the Middle East, begins to trigger a Taiwanese nuke, and a South Korean nuke, and a Japanese nuke, is not a world we're going to give our children. And so we're going to do what needs to be done. And our pilots and our warriors and our clever agents and spies and cyber warriors and all these people who I don't even understand what they do, but they do it at an unprecedented and impossible and almost magical level of competence. They are our heroes in this moment, and we owe them everything, and we will celebrate them no matter how much tut-tutting we have to face from everyone who wishes we would lose and die and go away because we cause them anxiety. In Devarim, Deuteronomy, the Bible commands the priests to speak to the people before they go to war and to remind them not to be afraid. And the priest is told to say the following words: Shema Yisrael, atem krevim hayom lemilchama al oivechem, al yerach levavchem, אל תראו ואל תחפזו ואל תארצו מפניהם, כי אדוני אלוהיכם ההולך עמכם להילחם לכם עם אויביכם, להושיע אתכם. Hear, O Israel, today you approach battle against your foes. Let not your heart be faint, do not be afraid, do not panic, and do not cower before them. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to deliver you. In the Yemeni Jewish prayer book, there's a special prayer that I want to add because it specifically talks about captives, about hostages. Our hostages still remain in captivity. השב בנינו מגבול אויב, תן תקווה לשבויים, ושיבה נכוחה לנלחמים. תהי תפילתנו לפניך לרחמים ולרצון. Return our sons from the enemy's border. Grant hope to the captives and bring the warriors home in safety. May our prayers stand before you for mercy and acceptance. Thank you for listening. I hope this goes well. I hope it goes fast. And I hope there's a new dawn for Iran, free from the shackles of a regime whose only success in 4 decades is the oppression of its own people. At everything else it has failed.
Amen.
Hello, everybody. Well,
Okay.
Hey everyone, welcome to week 72. Today's day 1. Today's Monday. This is the first day of our new week, and we're going to call this week, What Can I Learn From? This is going to be a version 2.0 because we had already done this week months ago, maybe last year. And this week is going to be, What Can I Learn From Caravaggio? So we'll see how we do. Okay, let's get started. This is going to be day 1. This is our first day of a week that's going to make a comeback. This is going to be another week of What Can I Learn From? And I think it was last year, if I'm not mistaken, but we had already done a week of What Can I Learn from Rembrandt. That was a super cool week because I thought it was really important for me, if I was going to do a week of trying to understand as guidance some of the greatest painters ever, I should start with my favorite painter and whom I consider to be the most important, the best painter, the biggest painter in art history, which is Rembrandt. I thought it was cool if we started there because there is something very unattainable about Rembrandt. There is a truth that we have to accept as soon as we see a Rembrandt painting, that is that we can't paint like Rembrandt.
Exactly.
We've had 450 years to try and paint like him, and we can't paint like him.
Ain't gonna
we can't
happen.
paint like him. I mean, that's just this plain and honest truth.
Yes.
There's been nobody after him that has been able to even remotely feel like they're getting close to painting like Rembrandt.
Absolutely.
It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. I think the more we understand about Rembrandt as a painter, and the more we understand about how paintings are made, the more we realize he had such a personal way of understanding paint layers, of modeling paint, of honestly doing incredibly fundamental things in ways that are so marvelous that I don't know, it's a question mark. I mean, you're always going to be able to find videos of people saying, hey, this is how you paint like Rembrandt on YouTube.
Sure.
And honestly, the more you see those videos, the more you realize, okay, this is not how you paint like Rembrandt. I could explain to you the idea behind a Rembrandt painting. I think we can all sort of rationalize how those paintings were made. It's honestly not any different than understanding any other Baroque painter of the time. He painted pretty much the same way that other people painted in the 17th century. So in that sense, there's no mystery to him. But it's not about the how. You realize at that moment that it has nothing to do with technique or brushes. There's something else to it, something extraordinary, something that one human being amongst billions of human beings throughout history was able to achieve. So when we did that week where we were saying, what can I learn from Rembrandt? We were very quick to say, we're not going to paint like Rembrandt because we can't, period. Period. Anyone that says the contrary, don't trust them. Nobody can paint like Rembrandt. They're either minimizing the genius that Rembrandt was, or they're actually thinking that they can paint like Rembrandt, which makes them completely blind to what painting actually is. So don't trust any of those videos. You're better off just reading about how paintings were made back then to understand them technically. But after that, then it's just pure genius. After that, you know, this incredible mind takes over and produces some of the most amazing paintings that have ever been produced. So I thought it would be cool if we brought that week back, and for this week, we speak a little bit about Caravaggio. And for me, it's pretty cool because I just recently had these weeks in Rome, and obviously Rome is the home of Caravaggio. Rome is where you're going to find some of the most incredible Caravaggio paintings in the world. And I was fortunate enough to be able to experience those paintings and to be able to feed my mind with a ton of ideas that come from these amazing works of art. So I thought, okay, as soon as I come back, we can do a week of What Can I Learn From? And we're going to start today by doing something very, very simple. Very, very simple. There's a bunch of Caravaggio paintings that are incredibly complicated. And I'm going to ask Danny to post a pic where we did a little study of the conversion of St. Paul, where I explored the composition and design that is behind this painting, and I talked a little bit about Caravaggio. So if you want to have some sense of who he was as a painter, you can check that video out. But I thought that for today, based on a painting that I saw in the Musei Capitolini of St. John the Baptist, I thought that for today we would start with a very fundamental aspect, which I think is one of the cornerstones of what Caravaggio did. Now, maybe you guys are thinking, oh, it has to be chiaroscuro. It has to be this exaggerated contrast between light and dark, because that's what Caravaggio does. If you close your eyes, and if somebody says Caravaggio, you don't even have to imagine a particular painting. You just have to think of the way he painted light. And you could argue that even though there's amazing painters of high Renaissance that came before him, he was one of the first painters to do a very sensible study of form in a contrasting light. There's no doubt about that. Without Caravaggio, there would be no Rembrandt. Even though Rembrandt is not Caravaggisti, he's not one of these painters that studied under Caravaggio or that, went to Rome to study his paintings. Even though Rembrandt would not fall under that, quote unquote school, he simply wouldn't be. His decision to take that understanding of designing through light and shadow would not exist if it wasn't for Caravaggio. If you take Caravaggio away, you break that chain in history, and a ton of other paintings and painters would just completely disappear. Giuseppe Rivera, for example, he simply wouldn't be either. So I thought it would be cool that instead of starting with the obvious, starting with that which is the closest thing that we have when we imagine what Caravaggio is, we could start with something that's a little bit bigger than that, a little more abstract than that, I would say, which is unity. And you guys have heard me speak about unity quite a lot, I think, because I try to push so much the idea of the whole in the painting, of wholeness in a painting. The concept of unity is of the utmost importance for me in my paintings. If there's one thing that I would want my paintings to have, it's just a sense of oneness, that there's this bigger idea that is affecting. My paintings can be composed of many singular elements, but they all fall under the rule of this, bigger idea of this oneness that is attempting to tie everything together. That's perhaps why I'm so big on atmosphere, because when we speak about oneness or wholeness or unity, those are very broad, abstract terms. And it's very hard to get a firm grasp on what that means. But atmosphere, when we speak about atmosphere, when we tie the idea of atmosphere to light, when we think about how much or how little we can see of something, at least in my brain, and maybe this is a me thing, but at least for me, that makes everything a little more comprehensible. Because I heard the idea of unity constantly when I was studying, but it's not something that you can get a really firm grasp on when you are designing your own paintings. Now, light and dark can help a ton with that idea, because when you tell somebody you have to mass in your lights, you have to mass in your shadows, then that starts to make a little more sense, and you're tying this idea of unity to form. So for me, the one that blew me away always was the idea behind unity in shadow, where if you've drawn from life or painted from life, and if you have a pretty strong light source, let's say skylight, or you have a pretty strong light box illuminating your model, that light is going to create very visible, very understandable, very decipherable masses of shadow. And I remember all my teachers just repeating the same thing, just mass in your shadows, block in your shadows, but block them as a whole. Don't try to see tiny differences in shadow when you're starting out. Just try to see a big, massive shadow. And it doesn't matter how you denominate the things that are within that shadow. So, for example, the body could be in shadow, but there's also drapery that can be in shadow. So there's going to be skin and cloth in shadow. We don't make a difference. We kind of try to understand shadow as this big enveloping mass that doesn't really care about what things are named, what we call things. So instead of trying to differentiate drapery from skin, what you do is just unify everything in that shadow. And there's a very beautiful idea behind doing that, which is that, and you guys have heard me say this, shadow doesn't describe form. Shadow doesn't have that responsibility. Now, this is not my take on it. This is not just how I see it. No, this is like this physical truth. We human beings have an understanding of the three-dimensionality of form because of light and because of the way we see things and because of the way our brain understands what we see, what we observe. So if it wasn't because of light, we wouldn't have, through our eyes and our brains, a visual understanding of the three-dimensionality of form. Now, if we use other senses, if we use our touch, to configure this idea of three-dimensionality, that's a different thing. But if we're interpreting visual stimuli, we depend on light to understand form. We depend on it. So light has the responsibility to model form, but shadow doesn't. Because think about it, if the whole world was in shadow, if there was no light, if all we saw was shadow, which is complete darkness, we would have absolutely no idea of the three-dimensionality of form. So this is something that's recurrent in Caravaggio. Because there is such a strong light source falling onto the figures that he paints, there is a shadow mass that's created. And because the light source feels like a small spotlight, and there's not enough light in that light source to create enough ambient light so that the shadows are filled up with information from that ambient light, we are going to get very dark, very deep shadows. There are many Caravaggio paintings where his shadows are pretty much this darker umber underpainting, and they are kind of left untouched. I mean, they're cleaned up, but there's tons of paintings where you're not going to see a lot of variation in those shadow masses. Now, having said that, there's obviously a lot of other paintings where you're going to see subtle variations within the shadow mass. There's going to be hints of reflected light. You're going to get a lot of those examples also. But as a general rule, it is really cool to see that in a lot of his paintings, the shadow mass is basically empty, if you will. I know I'm exaggerating this a little bit, but it's just to prove a point. And with that shadow mass being empty, the responsibility for modeling form falls entirely upon Light's shoulders. And that's where Caravaggio is just a complete genius, and he is an incredibly sensitive human being, and he's able to produce some of the most early, naturalistic, realistic modeling of form that you're ever going to see in painting history. So, like I was saying, I saw this one painting at Musei Capitolini of St. John the Baptist, which is a glorious painting. It has to be one of these quote-unquote smaller easel paintings as opposed to, the paintings that he would do for specific chapels, that I think gives you an idea of how beautiful and how powerful a painting can be, a depiction of form can be, if you respect those two ideas, unity in light and unity in shadow. I think the massive shadow that is enveloping the body of St. John the Baptist has to be one of the most beautifully sensitive masses of shadow painted ever. It's absolutely incredible. Now, obviously, there's very subtle little changes within that shadow, which is what makes the painting just a completely masterful piece of art. But the idea, the overarching idea that says that you should try to maintain unity within that shadow mass still remains to be true. So this painting of Danny today is almost like a reactionary piece to what we were doing last week by saying, I'm going to do a very, very simple painting today where I'm going to try to maintain unity in light and unity in shadow. Now, what does that mean? That instead of looking at all these tiny little bits of information that are within light and that are also within shadow, the sort of specificity of form that we many times think is essential when developing a portrait, I'm going to try to see if I can eliminate a ton of that information. Just simplify this a ton so that we can be aware of this idea of unity. Now, this is kind of cool because when we try to push certain ideas in our painting, we're many times not aware of it, but we have to make sacrifices. If we want to truly speak about something, and if we want to overemphasize it, if we want to caps lock what we want to say through a painting, that usually means that we're not going to be able to speak about countless other things that are possibilities that would be available to us. So we have to be aware that when we do a painting and when we try to push something, when we try to communicate something with hierarchy in our paintings, that means that we're going to have to sacrifice other things. For example, if you want to speak about atmosphere, like heavy, heavy atmosphere, that usually doesn't go hand in hand with detail. If you want to speak about detail, you have to sacrifice a little bit of the atmosphere so you can overemphasize all the information that is in minutia. So we just have to be aware of the sacrifices that we're going to make, and more importantly, we have to be okay with that. We have to understand that if we are going to make those sacrifices, our painting shouldn't be a painting that yearns for something else, for something that's not there. It should be a painting that celebrates what's there, where you as a painter feel absolutely comfortable saying, what I wanted to push in this painting makes me whole, makes me happy, it makes me excited about painting. So for today, I wanted to say, you know what, after seeing tons of Caravaggio paintings, after seeing that St. John the Baptist painting, I realized that one of the things that is of the utmost importance in his painting is the idea of unity and light and this beautiful embracing concept of unity and shadow. So I thought I would bring that to a painting, but bring that to a painting as an abstract concept. I mean, the idea, and hopefully I want to make this clear with this first painting, the idea is not to say, I want to learn something from Caravaggio, so I'm obviously going to paint 20 chiaroscuro paintings. I'm going to become a 21st century Caravaggisti. The idea is not to try and paint like Caravaggio, because what is the point in all of that?
You
What would be
can't
the point
either.
in trying to copy Caravaggio 450 years later? It doesn't make sense. The idea is to learn something from the people that we study. The idea is to be able to extract something from those painters that we respect, and we can say, oh my God, she was incredible at doing this, and I can apply that knowledge to my paintings this way. So for the first painting, I wanted to make that absolutely clear and say, I'm not going to do a chiaroscuro painting. I'm not going to equate Caravaggio with chiaroscuro, with this single small light source in an environment that is very dark, that produces these empty shadows, and that's what I'm going to paint throughout the week. No. You know, I think that would have been very one-to-one, very predictable, and I think that that's what's superficially readily available when you look at a Caravaggio painting. But we have to dig deeper to see what else is there. Aside from the things that are incredibly obvious, what can I learn from these paintings that I can feed into my own work and hopefully make it grow, make it more integral? So I decided not to do a darker atmosphere, and I decided I would go, obviously, you know, in my case, grayer, because I absolutely adore grayness, and I thought I would compress my values just a little bit, just to make it even far more evident that what I was looking for was a very simple idea of unity in light, unity in shadow, and even for me, I had trouble trying to convince myself that I wanted to eliminate information in light and in shadow. It was really, really tough for me to say, I'm going to get rid of a lot of the specificity of form, for example, in the features, in attempting to do this portrait. And I'm guessing it was difficult for me, having done the week last week, where I was just pushing a lot of those drawing marks that are very specific, that are highly specific, where I was almost like mapping out my drawing with that second layer that I kind of superimposed on that first painted layer. And because that was the rhythm of painting that I was doing from last week, it was a little bit different to shift into this idea of eliminating all that information and convincing myself that I would end up with a painting that doesn't feel like it's less. That to me is very important, that when I finish a painting session, I feel, okay, this is resolved. This is what I was trying to do. This is close to the objective that I set out for myself, and that feels fulfilling. If I do that, regardless if it looks more or less than the painting that I did last week, if I'm able to identify something and if I'm able to do it, then I'm going to feel fulfilled. Then I'm going to feel like, yes, today was a good painting session, and I think I understood what I was trying to paint. And I didn't let myself be distracted by other things that could have made the painting a little more exciting, a little bit better. No, it doesn't matter. Like, none of those thoughts enter my brain, because I constantly have to repeat myself, what am I trying to paint? You know, what is this painting about? And anything that deviates my thought from that, I have to eliminate it very quickly, or at least I have to answer the question, and I have to say, why is it that that thought that creeped into my brain is useless right now? What am I trying to do with my painting that justifies the way I'm painting it? So hopefully that's very clear with the painting that we did today. And more importantly, it communicates the message that we are going to say, what can I learn from Caravaggio this week? But we're not going to try to paint like Caravaggio, and we don't even have to try and do chiaroscuro like Caravaggio. It would be awesome, I think, as it happened with the week that we tried to learn something from Rembrandt, where we're really basing our paintings on these incredible masters' work, but we understand that we don't have to paint like them. We can actually make a painting that is based on everything that Rembrandt taught us, or in this case, like Caravaggio is going to teach us during this week, And it would be awesome if we end up with 5 paintings like we did on Rembrandt's Week, where we can say none of them look like Rembrandt, but all of them couldn't have been if it wasn't for everything that I learned about Rembrandt. So that's going to be it for today. Join us tomorrow, Spanish Tuesdays, Martes de Español, brush up on your Spanish, where we continue with this week where we're trying to learn something about Caravaggio, and we put it to use in our own painting, in our own terms. So we'll see how we do tomorrow. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Love you guys. Bye.
Une bonne journée commence par ton bien-être digestif.
Hey everyone, welcome to week 72. Today is day 4, and this is going to be our final day of the week. This is Thursday. This is our 4th day on our ongoing What Can I Learn From Caravaggio week. Hope you guys have enjoyed it. We'll see you next week. New theme. Okay, let's get started. This is day 4. This is going to be our final day in our What Can We Learn From Caravaggio week. And we're going to finish off this week with what is for sure the darkest side of Caravaggio. Caravaggio had a tumultuous life. I've read that people try to justify all the brawls that he got into by saying that he might have had early lead poisoning due to painting, and that's what caused him to get into fights and brawls constantly. But honestly, that's pure speculation. So we don't really know why there was such a dark side to his life, and it's something that we can't hide. Usually we are blind to these stories when we are looking at paintings. We are completely unaware of what was going on in these incredible painters' lives. And ideally, we would hope that, their lives are uneventful, right? That we can just enjoy what they did, and we don't have to hear stories about the horrible human beings that were behind the paintings, because it does bring up that question: if we are able to turn a blind eye, if we are able to disconnect the person from the art. But hopefully with the stories that I'm going to share today, we're going to see that it's actually impossible to disconnect the context of the human being and the artwork that was produced. Because nobody produces paintings, in this case, in a vacuum. I mean, paintings are born from moments in life. We can't abstract ourselves from everything that goes on around us. And if there is a kind of mysterious, sinister side to our lives, that is going to show in our paintings. We can't hide those sort of things. Painting, in particular, has this way of being so honest that it will reflect what happens on in our lives. So for today, we're going to do a purposely grotesque painting that echoes a lot of the sort of sinister tones that were very evident, particularly in later Caravaggio paintings. So I'm going to start with why I wanted to paint this, and it's actually a pretty interesting story. There's a very famous painting that Caravaggio did of Judith beheading Holofernes. And it may not be the most famous version of this painting. Artemisia Gentileschi did what is probably the most powerful painting that has ever been painted of this subject matter. Yes, her painting couldn't be if it wasn't for Caravaggio's take on this story, but Artemisia's painting is just so imbued with this air of revenge, of taking back power, that honestly nothing can compete with that painting. And even though I personally believe that if we compare the two paintings, that is the strongest of the paintings, Artemisia's painting. Let's go back to Caravaggio, because this is actually pretty important for the story that we're going to tell. Caravaggio did this painting around 1599, and because he was put in jail in 1600s, this painting may have been finished in 1602. So we could think that this is just depiction, a very gruesome, very realistic depiction of the beheading of Holofernes. But the truth was that in 1599, there was a very famous public beheading that happened in front of Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome. And that was the beheading of the Cenci family. And it's a horrible story, because the real victim of the story is Beatrice Cenci, who was beheaded when she was 22, but her tragic story starts when she's 7 years old. I mean, there's no exact date about this, but Beatrice's father was a Count Francesco Cenci. He was abusive towards her brothers, and he was a monster, and he raped Beatrice multiple times, and he was guilty of incest. That was the crime back then, and he was actually jailed for that and for other crimes, but because he was a count, because he was powerful, he was freed very quickly. So Beatrice, knowing that he was freed, she went to the authorities and she tried to tell them about the frequent mistreatment, and obviously the authorities did nothing, even though everyone in Rome knew the horrible piece of crap that Francesco Cenci was. So what Beatrice did was she got together with her brothers and her stepmother, because her mother had passed away, and they said, if there is going to be justice, it has to be by our own hands. And they tried to poison Francesco Cenci, but that didn't work out. So
Oh
they
my God.
decided, together with her siblings and her stepmother, they bludgeoned Francesco to death with a hammer, and they threw the body off a balcony to make it look like it was an accident. But ultimately, nobody believed that it was. And there was an investigation that was carried by the papal police. And even though they were trying to eliminate all evidence, the Cenci family was trying to eliminate all evidence, the papal police was torturing a ton of people, and they eventually found out the truth, and the plot was discovered, and they were all sentenced to death. Like I said, it was a horrible execution. They were taken to Sant'Angelo Bridge, where there was a scaffolding. Beatrice's older brother, Giacomo, was horribly tortured. They smashed his head with a mallet. I mean, this is dark stuff, so I apologize for all of this, but this is a true story that was happening at the time in Rome. And after they executed Giacomo, they killed Lucrezia, who was Beatrice's stepmother, and they finally beheaded Beatrice with an axe. Again, I
Jesus.
apologize, this is a horrible story. Sometimes we only want to look at paintings, and if we're looking at Judith and Holofernes, we just want to read about the story, and we want to believe that there's a narrative behind these stories, or we tend to feel far more comfortable when pagan myths are the basis for very dramatic paintings.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth is, there's real life behind this painting. There's a real life story behind Caravaggio's desire to paint this painting. And these public executions were very well known, and people would attend, and they believed that Caravaggio, he for sure witnessed this execution, and he carried some of that experience into his painting. And if you really think about it, this painting looks gruesome, yes, but it's very grounded. I mean, there is a sense of realism in what is happening, which is not really quite present in a lot of paintings before this one. I mean, painters were known for depicting martyrdoms of saints, and those are pretty sinister also. Those are pretty bleak paintings. But this painting in particular is very, very strong. And there was a public outcry for understanding Beatrice Cenci, as the real victim in all of this. So Caravaggio's painting, in a way, could be understood as symbolizing this after-death empowerment, the revenge that Beatrice rightfully deserved. Again, a very dark story, but it does give you historical context as to when this painting was painted and why Caravaggio suddenly had this willingness, this connection to depict with such naturalism a beheading, the act of decapitating somebody. I wish the story stopped there, but Caravaggio led a very, very complicated life. I mean, in his history, there's countless of moments where very powerful people were able to kind of sweep under the rug every wrongful thing that he was doing, and they constantly protected him. Until, I think it was in 1609, maybe, where even though he was known for just getting into fights and just beating people with clubs, taking out a sword and hitting people with a sword, eventually he got into a fight with this sort of gangster, this pimp, Tomasini, and they say they got into an argument over a prostitute that was one of Caravaggio's models that he loved, and in a failed attempt at castrating Tomasini, Caravaggio ends up killing him. Again, this is a story, there's a ton of versions, but that's the one I've read the most. So Caravaggio goes through his usual channels trying to find people that would protect him from that, but they couldn't. So he actually has to flee Rome because the authorities said that if people found Caravaggio on the street, they themselves could carry out the sentence, which was to behead him. So Caravaggio became obsessed with this idea, and it actually was the subject matter of a couple of his later paintings. There is a painting of Salome asking for the head of John the Baptist, and most famously there's a painting of David and Goliath, where David, who is presumed to be like a younger Caravaggio, or maybe it was his apprentice, is holding Caravaggio's head. That severed head is actually a self-portrait. And that particular painting was sent to Cardinal Borghese, who was an avid art collector, and he absolutely loved Caravaggio's work. And it was sent to him as a way of asking for pardon. I mean, some people say that there's remorse in this painting, that this was the way in which Caravaggio would tell Scipione Borghese, Cardinal Borghese, that he had repented. But when he heard news that maybe the pardon was going to happen, and he attempted to go back to Rome, he actually died. And there's a bunch of versions of how he died. Some people say that the Tomasini family actually killed him. Some people say that he died of syphilis. Some people say that he eventually died of lead poisoning. Some people say that he had been enrolled in Malta, and people from Malta were actually tracking him down to try to kill him. So again, Caravaggio was just like a really dark dude. This is not your regular life. Painters are not usually known for having to flee cities because they have a death sentence on them. I've always thought that there are levels to this, that there is a point where we can separate artists from art, right? That we can separate the human being from the artwork. Because if not, it is very, very hard. I mean, if we really have to get into every single person's life and try to put their actions in a scale and determine if they are ultimately worthy of us celebrating their art, I think that that's going to be a lifelong endeavor, because it's going to be very, very tough to understand, where we draw the line. But I think that in the case of Caravaggio, the stories about his uncontrollable fighting, him being a very violent man, they're all there. The stories about him being a murderer, it's true. These things are true. And we have to be conscious that these are the things that fed his paintings. These are the things that eventually led him to paint some of the images that he produced. So it's impossible to try and believe that these paintings were born from a vacuum. I think we have to be responsible as viewers, and we have to understand where these paintings come from. Now, to talk a little bit about how to deal with all this information and try to put it into a painting, I think that me being a father, having been blessed with Samu and Fer, I'm incredibly sensitive to what children being abused means, and it is something that destroys me. It is something that breaks my life. So Beatrice Cenci's story is no different than countless of stories in our human history, and stories that still go on nowadays. And what's most heart-wrenching about this story is that everyone in Rome knew the shit that Francesco Cenci was. And even though he was put in jail, he used his status as a count to be freed very rapidly. So there was no sense of justice there. And what's even sadder is that Beatrice went to the authorities and she told them about the abusive nature of her father, and they just didn't pay attention. So even though they committed a crime, it was a crime that for sure could have been avoided if authorities would have had the guts and the decency to say, it doesn't matter that you're a count, it doesn't matter that you have noble status, you have to be accountable and you have to pay for the crimes that you've committed. What pains me profoundly is the fact that Beatrice Cenci was a young woman at the time she was beheaded, but she was a girl when she was the subject of all this horrible physical abuse. And the nature of her being a young girl, the fact that she was a woman talking about incest, which is just an elegant way of speaking about rape, the fact that she was a girl was the reason why her story didn't garner attention. Her own voice was ultimately what devalued her. And this again is just horrendous. This is heartbreaking because, and I guess, this was the point of this painting, but it is direful to understand that what can cause the most harm in your life, even more harm than the physical harm that she was subjected to, was the fact that she was a young woman speaking the truth. So in my painting, I don't know, I guess it's a very heavy-handed way, but I am wearing my heart on my sleeve when I paint this, and when I imagine that Fer's only sin, the one thing that muffled her voice, the one thing that made her voice not be heard by authorities, was her own voice. So even though this is pretty strong, and for these stories that are behind these paintings, this is Fer being gagged by her own self. And like I said, it's very strong. It's very strong. I mean, this is something that's, I don't know, it's impossible for me to handle. So this was a way to not only look at, the genius that Caravaggio was, because that's undeniable. That's absolutely undeniable. I mean, as a painter, he is forever going to be one of the brightest minds to have ever painted. That cannot be argued. He was a genius. He was an absolute genius. But like I said, there's also this darkness that was feeding his paintings. And it was a darkness that was very much part of a context that we are unaware of. Because we may say, oh, Caravaggio killed a pimp. He castrated a pimp. So it was like an accidental murder, but that's not even close to what Francesco Cenci did to Beatrice and his mother. But there's one thing that ties these two men with status, which was that powerful people, time again, came to their rescue, and they were not held responsible for what they did. I mean, both of them did horrible things. One is an abuser and a rapist, and the other one is a murderer. Honestly, if there was justice in this world, and if there were beheadings at that time, they should have both been beheaded right then and there. That is the truth. So, like I said, this is tough subject matter, tough stories, but these are the stories behind the paintings we many times quietly venerate,
Yes.
and we have to be aware of that.
Yes.
So that was a dark way to end the week. I apologize for that, but hopefully it makes us appreciate the context that's behind the painting a lot more. So I wasn't going to shy away trying to tackle these tough questions,
Exactly.
and hopefully you guys understand that there was a reason for Fer's painting being. So that's going to be it for this week. We'll see you guys next week. We love you guys. Bye. Hey everyone, welcome to week 72. Today is day 3, Wednesday. This is our third day on our ongoing What Can I Learn from Caravaggio week. So we'll see how we're going to do. Okay, let's get started. This is day 3. This is our third day on our What Can We Learn from Caravaggio week. Remember, if you're interested in this week, maybe you will find our first What Can I Learn From week also interesting, where we studied Rembrandt. So if you've enjoyed these past couple of videos, be sure to check that week out. I think that one thing is very apparent from the first 2 paintings that we've done during this week, which is that our aim is not going to be to try and paint like Caravaggio. I mean, we could have that as our sole objective. Our goal for this week, even though I'm pretty sure a week is not close to being enough time to try to begin to understand how to paint in a Caravaggisti manner, that would probably take years, decades.
If not more.
But we could have done a sort of introduction to try and construct paintings in the manner in which Caravaggio used to construct them. And we could have done a study in the nature of light, the setup of light that we have to use to try and echo the lighting condition that Caravaggio so masterfully depicted. We would also have to understand our environment. So a small north light window, which is probably what Caravaggio used, is not the only thing that we need. We also need a space that is large enough to accommodate freely posing a model, but also dark enough where that single source of light doesn't end up flooding the space, providing us with ambient lighting that is going to end up filling our shadows with information.
Yeah.
What we want is a space that's dark enough where our light can't have incidence in our shadow mass. Our shadow mass is almost going to disappear into the atmosphere of that dark space that the figure inhabits. After that, it's just a study in depicting form, in understanding the modeling of form, in understanding structure. I hope I'm not making it sound like it's something simple, because it's not. That takes a long time. That can be a lifetime. Understanding form and how form turns in space, and to be able to do that in a realistic, sensible manner, that's a lifetime. You know, you could spend your whole life trying to do that consistently.
Yes.
So let's not minimize the fact that we could embark in this, very strange, I would say, endeavor of attempting to paint like Caravaggio, but that would obviously be impossible to do during a single week of painting. And aside from all the technical variables, I would say, what's the point? Honestly, what really is the point of trying to evoke 17th century painting in the 21st century? Just feels disconnected. So much of that painting, so much of that Baroque painting, particularly in Caravaggio's case, it was painting that was intrinsically tied to the church, to the Catholic Church. And that was the driving force for all these paintings.
Yeah.
Yesterday I was mentioning how moving it was for me, and it always is, when we go to San Luigi de' Francesi and we're able to see the chapel that holds the trilogy of paintings that Caravaggio did of the history of St. Matthew. And I'm expressing how lucky we are because we're able to see the paintings in the place, in the exact place, in the exact atmosphere where they were originally meant to be hung. You know, they were designed specifically for this space, and they were understood to be viewed in this space.
Absolutely.
And that is such a remarkable thing. That's such an incredible opportunity that we have as viewers to view these paintings as close to their original intent as we can access 430 years later. Because we're not going to be able to have that same exact experience that people who were able to observe them in the late 16th and early 17th century had, but we can at least understand the atmosphere that holds these paintings. And I think that that's something so incredible. I know that a lot of people that are able to see these paintings in these smaller chapels feel that it's kind of uncomfortable. You know, the paintings are high up, these are large paintings, and they're not really easy to see in the sense that there's not quote unquote good lighting falling onto these paintings. I mean, the best scenario that people would have in the late 16th, early 17th century was to have the church illuminated by candles, but there's not enough sunlight filtering through the windows to give you a sense of what these paintings would look like that would be similar to somewhat natural lighting that we would have access to if we were looking at them in a controlled setup in a museum. So these are paintings that are not meant to be viewed as if they were part of a private collection. These are paintings that are placed in this chapel and they belong to this chapel. So it's fascinating to see, for example, the amount of available light that you have in a church and that you have in a small chapel, and how your eyes just have to struggle to recognize the shapes that are configuring all these paintings. I think it must have been wild, absolutely wild. I mean, imagine these paintings. Nobody. I mean, there are examples of extraordinary painters. For example, Tiziano painted years before Caravaggio. So we have examples of beautiful, realistic, naturalist painting just kind of peeking its head through what was high Renaissance painting. But imagine being surrounded by these very elegant Italian paintings from the early and mid 16th century, and suddenly you're met by this deep, deep atmosphere where all you can tell is that there are these figures, these real human beings suddenly emerging from this darker atmosphere. And that's perhaps the context that is most important with Caravaggio's painting. He wasn't trying to talk to God anymore. He wasn't trying to speak about divinity. He was trying to do essentially philosophical propaganda for the church at the moment. The church was fighting Reformation, so they were trying to win people back, and they were hoping that they could make things in the Catholic Church accessible. And one of the most important things that starts happening in terms of iconography is that regular people started understanding themselves as the subjects of these paintings. They started to see themselves reflected in these paintings. This is something that's absolutely obvious and super clear to identify in the 17th century with Baroque painting. Imagine how that must have felt, that you understood religion, the Catholic Church in particular, as something that was quite almost arcane. You know, it was something that was sealed off, and only very literate people, only very rich people that had the ability to read could understand all the occult symbolism that was hidden under all these stories and all these images that were produced. But you could argue that before Baroque, the paintings that were done were not meant for the people, were not meant to be understood by the people. If you understood the symbolism that was behind paintings during the Renaissance, it's because you were educated. But the church in the 17th century was not really interested in gaining educated folks. They wanted more people. They were losing people to Protestantism, and they were like, okay, we got to start doing something. And this coincided beautifully with artists having now the sensibility to reflect people that felt real in settings that felt plausible, with light that enveloped and bathed bodies and made them feel palpable. So all of these things added up to the idea of regular people feeling that they could finally make a connection with these images. So saints, like in the case of St. Matthew, weren't these, again, divine beings that were different from all of us. They were suddenly now depicted as one of us. You know, people that had led their lives as one of us, and they were suddenly touched by God, or they had a calling, and they answered to that calling, and they achieved sanctity through fulfilling those This was all just an effort to try and connect with people. Again, I feel that we can't really begin to understand the impact that those images had at that point in time, because it is obviously not the world that we live in. And even though these spaces, they are still chapels within churches, even though the nature of these spaces hasn't changed, the way they must have viewed this transition towards this imagery back then, it must have been nothing short of revolutionary. It must have been something that nobody saw coming, nobody expected. And I'm pretty sure the images must have been so incredibly powerful that they just fit the narrative that the church was selling perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what the church needed. And that's one of the reasons why Caravaggio is an absolute genius. Yesterday I was making reference to particularly the painting of the martyrdom of St. Matthew,
Mm-hmm.
because I think it's a very, very strange painting. It is not uncommon for Caravaggio to have done early versions of paintings that we know now to be extraordinary. For example, the painting that's in the altar of this chapel, the painting of the Inspiration of St. Matthew,
Mm-hmm.
this is actually the second version of that painting. The first version was too risque, I'm going to say. It was very sensual even, and it depicted a close conversation between the angel and St. Matthew, because the angel basically was telling St. Matthew what to write, but there was a ton of closeness. And I think that even for the church, that was a little too much. That bridging the gap between the divine and the human was a little too close. There still needed to be some separation between God, between divinity, and human beings. But the first version, which we lost during World War II, it was just a little too close. It was a little too almost like private. And I'm guessing they still wanted to have like a separation between, the heavens and the earth. So Caravaggio ends up doing the version of the painting that we all know now. But this wasn't something that was abnormal. Caravaggio, for example, and I spoke about this with the conversion of St. Paul, he also does a first version of that painting. And they thought that painting was just too weird. It's a jumbled mess. I think Caravaggio had like the heart of a very mannerist painter. He's a very strange, peculiar painter. I think that while some of his compositions are clearly based on other classical subject matter, he was also incredibly innovative in terms of composition. I mean, he was doing stuff that nobody else was doing at that time.
Exactly.
And I wanted to concentrate on the martyrdom of St. Matthew because there was a horizontal composition, an original horizontal composition that's underneath, this final painting that very much echoed what he was doing with the Calling of St. Matthew, which is the painting that's directly in front of it in the chapel. And I'm guessing that they asked him to just punch it up a little more, make that drama, that theatrical quality in his paintings just a little more evident. And he ends up doing this painting. He ends up doing something that we have never seen. I mean, the direction of the light, the way form is described, the way the figures are placed in this almost like abstract space, the way they're juxtaposed, the weird hierarchical but not really manner in which he understands the dimensions of the figures. The scales are so eclectic. I think that this composition is incredibly contemporary. I love that. I love that because I think that it is so jumbled, it is so all over the place, that the one thing that's keeping it together, the glue that's holding this piece together, obviously it's atmosphere, obviously it's this darker atmosphere that doesn't really describe a space. I mean, there's moments where it hints at a space, but it ends up feeling like a stage. It ends up feeling literally like theater. And I think that the nature of that image is what ends up binding and making possible the fact that there's these tons of like little narratives going on in the painting that should not really work together, but he's able to just put so much, he threw so much into this painting that he was able to achieve this, again, this very eclectic mess, but it just makes sense. So
Absolutely.
for today, I wanted to see if we could concentrate on that theatricality and obviously not try to do a multi-figured composition because we don't really have time to do that, and that's incredibly complex. But I was trying to tap into some of that drama for today with a single subject matter. So Danny almost feels like this rocket that's taking off into space, and the base of this very slender pyramid, it's just a very light shirt. There's light hitting her chest that's actually flooding into the shirt, so there's no real differentiation between chest. It's framed by this darker atmosphere, also framed by this darker mass of hair that is pulling you up to this portrait where we as observers, and this is a very small piece, we as observers feel like we're looking up at this figure. And even though I feel like I crop into my paintings quite a bit, like I really focus in on my subject matter a lot with the paintings that I've been doing in this project. I don't really paint a lot of the space that the figures inhabit. I'd like to believe that I always suggest that there is something happening outside the realm of the painting. I always feel that that's something kind of incredible. I always feel that if the painting can point to something that is
beyond
happening
it.
outside the universe of this painting,
Absolutely.
I like it. I feel that that's like super, super interesting. So
Absolutely.
I can imagine Danny having this, you know, very dramatic reaction to something that is beyond the parameters of the painting. And I particularly love that. So when I was doing this, it kind of reminded me of the Macbeth painting that Sargent did. You know, it's kind of charged with some of that drama. That painting is absurdly amazing. I'm not comparing myself to Sargent. I would never do that. I'm not that much of an idiot. I know my place in painting, so don't worry about that. But I just have etched in my brain the look and the emotion that Sargent was able to paint. And when I was painting Danny, I was trying to feed off of that and solve a painting the only way I know how to solve it. But I was hoping I could get some of that energy. So that's going to be it for today. We concentrated on theater and drama that are obviously incredibly present in almost every single Caravaggio painting. So join us tomorrow where we will investigate another aspect of Caravaggio and we'll try to figure out how to incorporate it into our own painting. Remember, the important part of this equation is the fact that we end up painting something. What we want to do is for our paintings to feel our own first and foremost, but they are images that are conscious of the teachings that Caravaggio has provided us with. So that's going to be tomorrow. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Love you guys. Bye.